Singularity.
My name is Nicola, and you're watching Singularity FM, the place where we interview the future. If you guys enjoy this podcast, you can show appreciation by writing a brief review on iTunes or visiting interviewthefuture.com and becoming a patron. Today, my guest is a college dropout who decided to travel across Asia on a princely yearly budget of $2,500. He later co founded Wired Magazine and was a long term senior maverick and editor there. He's co chair of the Long Now Foundation, a founder of the popular Cool Tools website, and the author of multiple best selling books about the future of technology. His newest book is Excellent Advice for Living Wisdom I Wish I'd Known Earlier. So, Kevin Kelly, welcome back to Singularity FM.
It's my pleasure. I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you so much for inviting me, and it's a real honor and privilege to be here.
We were due to do another interview because the first one we did, you probably don't remember, was about 13 years ago when I was starting my podcast. And then we talked about your most recent book at that time, which was What Technology Wants. Then, about 7 years later, which is to say about 6 years ago, we talked about the inevitable, also about things such as AI, the technological singularity, and so on. And now somehow we come to discuss wisdom, which in a way has been the topic of my work throughout all that time, because my thesis on my blog and my podcast has always been that technology is not enough. It is necessary, it is not sufficient. So, and by the way, guys, for everyone in the audience, I highly recommend you check out my previous two interviews with Kevin Kelly because I rewatched them right before this as part of my preparation alongside reading his book, and they're full of gems. So I highly recommend checking them out because we are not going to repeat many of the topics or any of them, maybe, and we will try to cover new grounds today. So, Kevin, why wisdom?
Wisdom, I think, in the end, is a perspective that has a long horizon, a long view. And I've become more increasingly convinced of the benefits of taking a longer view. So when I think about people who are wise, they tend to be able to think long term more at a generational scale. And I find that very attractive and necessary in the today's world where we're moving so fast. The faster you move, the longer you need to have a perspective. The longer your perspective needs to be, the faster you go. So, because it's like if you're in a race car going faster, you kind of need to look further ahead. And so this idea of that perspective, I think, is a lot of what wisdom is.
Mm-hmm. So let me push you a little bit deeper, though. So, if you were to define wisdom, then would you define it as the long view or the long term perspective? Or is there more to it? Something else that we need to add in?
I think there is a long-term perspective, but there's also a sense of what it is that you're pointing towards. There is the, true, good, and beautiful. There is a sense in which there's a value of that long-term perspective. So if you were kind of like an evil villain taking the long term to blow up the earth, okay, I wouldn't say that was wise. But so there's, in addition to that long direction, I think there's also a value which is elevating the true, good, and beautiful. And I think maybe the summary of that is the maximum good for the maximum people over the maximum time. So that sense of trying to maximize the good, true, and beautiful, I think, is also part of being wise.
I love that because it smacks highly ancient Greek and sort of Aristotelian, Platonic in its essence, and I am very much of that school
Sure.
myself. Uh, But the second thing you said, which I also agree with you, I mean, I agree with everything you said so far about the necessity of wisdom
Mm-hmm.
and the maximum good for the maximum amount of people. But someone would point out that's also kind of utilitarian in nature, and I don't think you're a utilitarian. So let's preclude those attacks right here.
I'm not sure what you mean that I'm not utilitarian. So, um, explain what you mean by utilitarian.
Well, so you know, Jeremy Bentham's philosophical school of utilitarianism, which kind of is summed up by what you just said, the maximum good for the maximum people. But if I remember from the previous interview, you're more of a, what was it? Um, what's the right word I'm looking for here? I don't want to say individualist, but kind of libertarian leaning in a way. Is that not correct?
No, I don't know. One of my bits of advice is that if your views on one thing can be predicted from your views on another thing, you should be careful because you could be in the grip of an ideology. So I'm not necessarily maybe very easy to summarize in my views.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's perfect. And I totally agree with that point is that when you're a thinking thing, actually you tend to be a little bit more paradoxical and less consistent and more
Right,
human,
right.
whereas perfect consistency and is basically slavish following
I
of an
yeah,
ideology.
it's dogma. So
Yeah.
um, rather than yeah, again, is the maximum good for the maximum people? Is that the only thing that's important in life? No, obviously not. I think that as humans, we have things like joy. So we sometimes construct our lives to selfishly enjoy something that may not be at that moment trying to maximize good for the maximum people. So, but I think when someone's, and there is wisdom in rewarding ourselves with the joy of being alive and, eating chocolate pudding and just enjoying that moment. We're not trying to do it. So I think to say that wisdom is the only thing that matters in the world, I think is incorrect. I wouldn't go so far as to say that. I would just say that it's another quality that we should try to increase. And like lots of things, I think it's a skill. Like optimism, which is also a skill, something a habit that you can get better at. You can get better. You can get wiser. You can become more optimistic. And so I would say this is a value that we want to emphasize, but I wouldn't say it's the only thing that counts.
Yeah. And to be honest, with you, I associate with that very much because especially with maybe the phenomenon that wisdom is a little bit fragmented
Mm.
because I tend to collect those fragments or proverbs or sayings or pieces of wisdom, if you want to call them. I started around high school and I have a big sort of notebook where I've collected
Right,
those
right.
over the years. And I love books like yours. Before you, I was reading a book by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who has a
Yeah.
similar book like you, also full of very original pieces of wisdom. And yours, I kind of more connected with yours. I mean, his were very witty and very poetic and awesome in many ways, very counterintuitive. But somehow I connected with yours a lot better. So let's start with the first one, and maybe you would understand my previous point, or we would place in context my previous point about trying to preclude some attacks. So
Mhm.
let's start with the first one here. Learn how to learn from those you disagree with or even offend you. See if you can find the truth in what they believe. So tell me a little bit about this one and how you learned this one.
Yeah, it took me a while to kind of arrive at this. This was not something that I necessarily understood when I was younger, but being around people who were maybe very accomplished, whom I found that found disagreeable. I found that I disagreed with them and their views, or maybe their personality. I didn't jive, but um, because other people respected them, maybe even other people that I respected, I had to look a little deeper to see what it was. And having gone through this a number of times, I realized that most people, maybe all people, have something to offer me if I am kind of humble enough to receive it. And it's that the humbling of of being patient, of realizing that even though I don't like them, I can still respect them, and listen, understanding that they have something that that they know that I don't know, or a quality that I don't have. And so people are very complicated, and I don't believe in bad people. I think there are people who do bad things, but even those, and this is the great understanding of people who write stories, it's the villain. The villain has to have something that we connect with us, something that's human about them, because even doing bad things, there are still good parts about them, and being able to kind of understand and learn from them is a superpower, because you're not then confining, you're broadening what it is that you can learn, not just from things about people who are similar to yourself. And so um that's a big step. That's a big step to ask, is to somebody that you find disagreeable. It could be a politician, it could be a thinker that we disagree with on most things, but then I've found myself, oh, well, they said something that I really agree, and there's some insight that I appreciated, that even though I kind of find the rest of what they're saying to be maybe even reprehensible, but nonetheless, I can learn something from them.
Well, let's try this one out then. I shared on the internet
Mm-hmm.
the fact that I'm going to be doing soon my
Sure.
third interview with you on the topic of wisdom. And I got a variety of comments. One of them was something to the sort of, why would I want to learn wisdom from this creationist?
Right. Well, I'm not a creationist, but
So, so, uh, well, say more about that. Then dispel that idea, because people have the perception, or at least that person had the perception, that you're a very religious person, and therefore creationist, and
right.
therefore there's nothing to be seen there,
Yeah, 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 yeah,
and
yeah.
end of case.
Sure. Well, there's so many things going on there. I am a Christian, but anybody who's read my books would know that I embrace fully evolution in its extreme form of, like Dan Dennett says, probably one of the most profound ideas we've ever had. Um, and so, and the thing about evolution, of course, is that it can be imported into mechanical, artificial things, and that's the profound thing. It's not a supernatural phenomenon. It's a very, very physical phenomena that's baked into the nature of the universe. Okay, so creation is, I am opposite of creationist. Um, I'm a Christian, and so I guess this person needs to talk to more people to realize that um, not all Christians are creationist. I mean, so I wonder about this person, how much contact they've had with actual Christians in the modern world to understand that those two are not exclusive.
So is that a part of the paradox of being human, or is there some kind of an inherent tension, maybe perhaps apparent or falsely perceived, between Christianity and evolution?
No, there doesn't need to be. Um, the I think the issue comes up that there's a inherent paradox in whatever view we have of the origin of the universe. Okay, so um, what's your theory on where the universe came from? Why did it begin? No matter whether you can say, well, it always was. That's one theory, is that the universe never began, it always was. Well, that's very unsatisfying. or that it came out by itself, it made itself. That's unsatisfying. You could say, well, God made it, but then where did God come from? Did God make himself? That's unsatisfying. There's no satisfactory answer, is all I'm saying. And so so there's no satisfactory answer. And right now, science is unable to prove or disprove any of these statements. So my preference is to believe the one that has the best story.
Mm-hmm.
And the best story I find is the Christian story. So, which is that God made evolution. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
uh, the thing about it is that it's, as I said, there isn't a logical scientific view. The Big Bang is not a scientific explanation about the origin of the Big Bang. It's the story of the origin of the universe, which I think is correct. But the question about what caused the Big Bang, we don't have a theory. We don't have a scientific theory about that. And so in lieu of that, I'll believe the more interesting story, which is that God made the universe and unleashed evolution within it. But who made God? That's a good question. The definition I would say is God is a self-created being, and again, that's unsatisfying.
That's again very Aristotelian, like the primary mover or the first mover,
Right.
he called him. But going back to your first, do you call them proverbs or fragments or pieces of wisdom? How do you
Yeah.
call them?
Yeah, bits of wisdom, proverbs, adages, lessons, maxims.
I love
There's
fragments personally.
fragments. Okay. Well, fragments, I'm not sure they're fragments because I actually worked hard to have them contain something whole, to be complete in some senses. But they are seeds. Actually, one person, I had a great term. They're zip files. Okay. You can unzip these. They're like little seeds that can be unpacked. So maybe that's what you kind of indicate by fragments. But I think they're more complete, like a seed. A seed's not really a fragment.
It's been maybe 30 years since I started collecting them, but the first one I collected was on why they're called fragments. And let me see if I can remember it off the top of my head. But the reason why, and it's a Bulgarian author who called them fragments, and the reason he said was that truth is always imperfect or partial. So
Yeah.
at best we can get little glimpses, that's to say
Sure.
little fragments, little pieces out of it, but never the whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I would definitely say these are lowercase truths, not a capital T.
Yeah, yeah. Great. So, but going back to your first point, uh, or proverb or fragment or seed, what is it that we can learn from this person in this context? What do you learn from someone who is maybe even kind of offending? As you said, even people
Mm.
who offend you or criticize you, you can
Yeah.
learn from
Yeah.
them. So, in this
Well,
context,
yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't know this person. They're obviously going to be much deeper and more complicated than their one remark, which was probably made without thinking. So I am sure. I would bet anything that that person has a lot to teach me. They obviously don't have much to teach me about creationism because or Christianity because they don't seem to know much about that. But there's probably other things that they know far, far more than I know. I don't know who they are, so I don't know
mhm.
what it is.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't know them too. It was just
Yeah,
someone
yeah.
who made a remark, but I found it interesting because it goes to the core of your first
Mm-hmm.
seat here. And also because I would invite my audience to literally to open your book with an open mind. And I honestly think it's full of wisdom. I think it's your by far the best
Yeah.
book in my view, the most useful one.
Yeah.
I think also by far
Sure.
the most useful immediately to our personal lives, both
Mm-hmm.
even professionally, but in every aspect of our life. Take this short book, very quick read. You can read it for a few hours in an afternoon,
Mm-hmm.
and you can reread it, and every time you would find a new gem or rediscover a new angle on an old gem that you have there. It's totally brilliant. I'm a big fan of it personally. So let me pull back a little bit though from your book and talk about our current context in time. It seems that right now the biggest topic of conversation is not wisdom. but technology in general and AI in particular.
Mm-hmm.
So, is that kind of putting the cart in front of the horse?
Mm. It is a little bit, because it's about intelligence, and um, we should not confuse intelligence and wisdom. Um, First of all, as hard as wisdom is to define, intelligence is even harder. We really don't know, even today, what it is. Um, and um, and one of the reasons why I'm very excited about AI is because I think AI, in its attempt to make it in all of its various forms, will teach us more about our own being, our own intelligence, than any neuroscience and psychology has for the past 200 years. We're going to learn more by trying to make these artificially. I have a proto theory right now that dreaming, that kind of dream hallucinating state may actually be the default state of the brain. It's not that it may be that we tame our hallucinatory aspects that we see in AI, that we tame that in order to be awake, but that the fundamental behavior of our own minds may be that hallucinating state that we see in AI. But anyway, this is not important. It's only that to say that I suspect that we'll have many, many insights about how our own brains work from trying to make artificial versions of them. And uh, confusing that with wisdom, I think, is a mistake, because one of the things that's happening with AI is, because it's about intelligence, I think intelligence is overrated in general. This is one of the reasons why I don't believe in the singularity nonsense about the AIs taking over, is because it's to do things in the world, you need more than intelligence. If you take an Einstein and a tiger and put them in a cage, who lives? It's not the smartest person. It's not the smartest person, the smartest people who are going to succeed in doing things. You need to have perseverance. You need to have other qualities. You need to have empathy.
If you
You need
put
to have
Einstein and a rat on a desert island, guess who's going to survive?
yeah, right, exactly. So there's an intent, there's a misguided idea that intelligence trumps everything. Well, it does if it's a black box, but if it's trying to actually affect the world, to make things happen, you need so much more than just intelligence. It's not the smartest people who necessarily succeed in getting things done. It's there are so many other qualities that we need to affect change. And so, um, in that one way, I think we're kind of overhyping what we have right now. I think we're underhyping in the long term, because I think um, the thing that we're doing with this is inventing many different varieties of minds, and they're going to fill our world with new powers and new things that are really, really going to affect everything that we do. So literally everything we can do will have some bearing on that, and that's why it's important. But it's going to take a long time for us to figure out what it is. I think um, I think the changes recently, the fast changes recently, I think are still not preparing us for how long, and how many steps we actually are going to have to go through to keep progressing. Um, I think there's going to be punctuated equilibrium, they call it in evolution, where you have these periods of very rapid change, and then they kind of plateau out, and then there's another period later on. We're in this period of the quantum jump in the punctuated equilibrium of evolution, and we can expect a little bit of it, pausing a little bit later on, naturally, not from any kind of signature letter, but just pausing, because um, right now most of the advances we have are by increasing the computation, increasing the compute, and at some point that's just not going to keep making the same progress. You have to have a different paradigm which is much more difficult and much slower.
Yeah, I agree with you. There's so many interesting things that you said here that you want to grab, but I want to just continue a little bit the thought of at the
Yeah,
beginning
yeah.
that you had there about um, AI and helping us define humanity. In fact, in your previous interview with me, or even in that book
Mm-hmm.
that we discussed during the previous interview, you said that the greatest benefit of the arrival of AI is that AI will help us define humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Because in a way, we need AI to tell us who we are.
Right.
So I wonder, do we need artificial intelligence now in the context of our present conversation? Do we need AI to recognize the value of wisdom?
Yeah, I think I do in a certain sense. I think we would like in a very practical way to instill into some of these machines a sense of wisdom, just like we wanted to give them ethics and morality, which we again need to do for those. Not all of the AIs, there are going to be many kinds, will necessarily need that, because first of all, consciousness itself is a liability in most of these AIs. We don't really want to give them. There's no use for it. They'll do better without it. But there will be some AIs that we want to be self-reflective and conscious. And for those, I think we do want to have a sense of wisdom, of a longer view, of priorities, of aiming at the true, good, and beautiful. Yes, we will need to work on a way to encapsulate and code wisdom into these entities. And I have actually, I think I might have mentioned before, been working on a side project called A Catechism for Robots, which is basically that. It's trying to say, what would we teach them? How would we code that? And what would um, we tell them to guide them in the long term, to elevate the horizon and point them in a direction? And so maybe I hadn't thought about it, but maybe this book is sort of like a preliminary warm up for trying to do that, because we do need to code them, and that's what they respond to. And I've said this before about the ethics, is that it's easy to give the robots ethics. It's very hard for us to decide what we want them to do, how we can be better than humans. We don't even know what that looks like. And so maybe this book is a first step in trying to enunciate and to articulate what a better human might look like.
Yeah, and actually, in our previous conversation, we talked a lot about the things you would want to say to and teach your three children.
Right.
And in a way, this book goes
Yeah.
right to that point.
Right.
And of course, as Hans Moravec said, the AIs or the robots would be our mind children.
Mind children. Yeah.
And I think
100%.
that in a way, it's not going to be that different, because with presuming they're conscious and intelligent,
Yeah.
just as our children are,
Some will be. Again, I want to
yeah,
emphasize some.
those that are of
Yeah.
them, those that are, then we basically have to do the same things that we do towards our kids more or less, when we try to teach them the right way
Yep.
in life and to upbring them to be good, decent human beings.
Right. Right.
I think it's the same principle with them, not much difference
Yeah.
in its essence.
Right. I think there will be some differences. The way that we try to train our kids was not by telling them, but by modeling the behavior. And so we might not have that privilege of modeling the behavior for the AIs. We may have to actually code it in, which is a much more difficult problem.
Well,
Um,
databases are basically a bank of model behavior in a way, right?
right. Well, that's the problem with the AIs right now, is that they are trained on the average human.
Yeah,
They're trained on the best and the worst of humans, so
yeah,
it's kind of comes out average. And the average human is not particularly what we want to be.
yeah.
And that's why they are kind of a little racist and sexist, is because that's the average human. And then we're saying, no, 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 no. We're not going to accept that. You got to be better than the average. And so the AI is kind of saying, well, what does that look like?
Yeah.
Well, so now we have to kind of say, well, here's what it looks like. This is what the better version of ourselves looks like, but we don't have a consensus on what that is. Is it like woke? Is it post woke? Is it super woke? What does this look like? And so that is the challenge is us actually imagining what a better version of ourselves would look like.
Well, here's a little suggestion, perhaps, towards the direction that we might want to explore. And it's a little bit of a redefinition of your uh, concept or perception or definition of wisdom. I would suggest that, and we're coming to one other of your seats. That's one of my favorites on page 166, which I would quote in a second. But it has to do with power. And you mentioned already, you touched upon the new powers that those AIs would give us.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
I would say wisdom has a lot to do with the power of being able to do something, but having the discipline
Yeah.
to stop and consider whether
Mm.
having the power to do it is necessarily a blank check to actually do it, or whether maybe you should exercise that discipline and not do it, or do it in a different way, which may not be the first way that comes to mind. So in other words, maybe wisdom is about the exercise of power in a way that's non-detrimental, as you said in the beginning, the
Mm-hmm.
maximum benefit to the maximum
Yeah.
people and the minimum cost to the maximum people, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Something I'm just improvising, but some.
Yeah, there may be something there. Power. Um, I find power is kind of for myself a hard concept to conjure with because it seems to have, or maybe works in different dimensions. There's political power, there's social power, there's economic power. They may not all be operating at the same time and the same people. Um, there's, we talk about power relationships, and I'm not even sure exactly what the metrics for those are.
Power
But
is the ability to affect change for me.
yeah, so a good question, because I said I don't think a good question would be, would people generally agree that a random average person today, born and alive and as an adult, would have more power than somebody 1,000 years ago? Is that is
Then
that
the
what we're
average
saying?
from 1,000 years ago, I would venture to say yes.
That they have more power in terms of affecting the world? I mean, because they have a larger reach, or the a person 1,000 years ago could affect the world around him?
First, our
Um,
levers 1,000 years ago were much weaker. So the multiplication effect of any one single individual
uh huh.
to affect the world around us 1,000 years ago was hundreds, thousands, million-fold less than it is today, I think. Uh,
I'm
that's
not
kind of like,
sure. I'm not sure about that.
you're not
Trying to
okay.
imagine. Um, when you talk about like affecting, I mean, I think what might happen is that we have an expanded circle of how far away, or how we can affect more people and more of the world at a distance and more people. But I'm not sure that the total amount, like,
Let me give you an example, scientific
yeah,
example. So we have the nuclear clock, right? It's created by supposedly the top,
yeah,
however many scientists
yeah,
they
yeah,
are, and each year they either move the dial closer to
yeah.
midnight or
I
away.
understand it. Yeah,
And now we are the closest to midnight we've ever been in the history of our civilization.
right,
So, on the one hand, we have the highest technological peak of our civilization that we've ever had
right,
in the past, in the history of our civilization.
yeah.
And on the other hand, according to those scientists, we've never been closer to total annihilation,
Well,
which
that's
is
a
why they've
collective.
moved
That's
the
not
dial.
individual. That's not an individual. We're talking about individual. So I did a study of trying to see whether an individual's power to kill people, to be violent, has increased over time, and it hasn't. right? So like one
Really,
person,
that's very counterproductive.
one
Please explain that. I mean,
okay.
counterintuitive.
So let's say you are an evil. So I was saying, what's the data? Not what could we imagine, but what actually is the data of a single person by themselves, working with no partners. What's the most that that person has ever killed?
Hmm.
Okay, so hundreds of years ago, they could set a building on fire and kill a couple hundred people. That's the maximum so far that I've been able to find out that any single individual working by themselves
Mm-hmm.
has done. You would say, well, if the power has increased, then they could kill thousands or tens of thousands of people by themselves. I haven't found any evidence of that so far. Okay, there's a Manhattan Project, which killed millions of people, but there were hundreds of thousands of people involved in that. So the average, it's kind of a gruesome calculation, but the average per person is still not very much. And
Well,
you have kind of cults and things, and they do it. But if you again divide up by the people involved and the number killed, it hasn't increased any.
my thing with this is why it sounds counterintuitive to me is because technology acts as a lever, as a multiplier, right? And so my thinking is like, well, if you had a person with a knife 1,000 years ago, he can slaughter so many people. If you have a
Right,
person with an M16 today, or an AK-47, or a howitzer, or a tank, or a plane, the higher you go up the weapon scale, which is the technological
right.
sophistication, the more damage you can do. And you can engineer now a single person can engineer a virus.
Right,
And
but it has to happen. This is the same. If you take the scientific evidence of what we have so far, there's no evidence of that happening. And I think it's in part because a lot of these technologies, although powerful, are actually more social than before. Okay, so just to make the technology work, you cannot do it alone. We're no longer so individualistic. We're much more socialistic in that sense, or mutualistic, needing it. And so, yes, you have sophisticated technologies, but they can't be it's really hard to amplify them by yourself. Collectively, there's no argument that we have more power collectively. And that's where I think the power is. It's not individually. It's the fact that we are more collaborative, more collective, and as a society,
how about this?
technology has leveraged us, but not individually.
Here's an example. Storytellers. And
Right,
the storytellers can be the most evil people. So take Hitler. He came
right,
out from nothing.
right, right,
Forget technology. I was going maybe in the wrong path. Hitler came in and told a story,
right.
and that story permeated through a whole society.
Sure.
And then that whole society took on the war path and
Right,
extermination and genocide and crimes
right,
against humanity. So
right.
you had one person who told a specific story, and the result of that was an utter disaster. Millions
Right,
of people dead.
with the cooperation of millions of people who cooperated with that.
Sure.
So Hitler himself could not, by himself, done that damage. It's only by, and again, this is to my point that the leverage of technology increasingly go to the collective rather than to the individual.
But the collective can be manipulated, is what I'm
Yes,
saying.
it can be. It can be manipulated, but it's powerless. It can be guided. It's what leadership is about.
Hmm.
We respond. We need the leadership for the guidance. But I think the power, the technology, increasingly, the technology becomes the technium. It's no longer a standalone, and so it becomes much more embedded in the collective, and it's no it can amplify and give new things for the human individual to do. We can do many things, um, like we don't have to have an answering machine. We don't have to fill up our own gas. There's many things we do, but there are many things that we don't do anymore. But I think the real leverage is at the collective rather than at the individual.
Okay, so let's shift the level of analysis
Sure.
to the collective then. The previous thing that we've mentioned, what would you say is the lesson from that kind of observation that on the one hand, we are at the peak of our civilization, technologically speaking, in terms of our technological power, which is to say our collective ability to
Uh-huh.
affect change at the
Sure. Yeah.
global level is
Right. Right.
unparalleled now.
Right.
And
Exactly.
at the same time, we are the closest we've ever been to our own annihilation, according to those scientists.
I don't believe that.
Okay, please say more.
I don't think there's any way that nuclear power can eliminate humans. That's just not.
Really?
No, there's no way. I mean, if you think through the actual steps of what would happen and how how this is going to eliminate all the humans on the planet, I I haven't seen this story. I haven't seen the progress of how that happens. So you have, um, um, you know,
Let me suggest a story. Perhaps I'm a
okay,
former recovering political scientist. My
sure, sure,
master's degree was armed conflict.
sure,
My thesis was on AI in times of war, but before that, I studied a little bit of nuclear
yeah,
stuff. And one thing is that, you know, in the 70s and 80s, we had these estimates based on a variety of sort of calculations
yeah,
based
yeah,
on those nuclear tests that we did. And based on them, we thought that what you just said made sense, that it's unlikely there will be a total annihilation.
right,
Then, now we're digitizing many of those old films and tests.
mm,
Turns out the nuclear yield on average was wrong, anywhere from 30 to 60% wrong. And turns out that the total math of aggregating the number of nuclear weapons we have now in the world, plus the fact that the yield and the damage we know
uh-huh,
is higher both in the short term and in the long term, may be sufficient to create another extinction event similar to the one 65 million years
yeah,
ago to the dinosaurs, because the sun would be blocked for a very prolonged, we'll have nuclear winter all around the planet for maybe a couple of years, which means no crops, etc., etc., air pollution, radiation, all of the above, right? So maybe some microorganisms or cockroaches or lower degree, more adaptable organisms would survive, but us
right.
humans who require very specific narrow band to exist uh, are unlikely to. Is that not a good story for you? Not convincing?
Not no, not convincing enough.
Okay.
One is, I mean, I would say that I have not looked at those calculations that you have, um, but I think um, what's the word I want? There's also what I find hard to believe is this idea that there would be that many nuclear bombs set off all at the same time, um, and uh, there's the issue of whether even some of those bombs even go off at this point, um, which we haven't also tested recently. So I remain, I would say,
Optimist.
well, yes. So I want to what's the word? Admit my ignorance here. So you could be right. Having have closer contact with those calculations than I have, and maybe more current. All I would say is I'm ignorantly skeptical of those calculations, um, and particularly the idea that I'm not arguing that there couldn't be massive millions of people dying, massive disruption. What I was arguing against was elimination of humans on the planet. Okay, and so that is something that um, I would like to I would like to see more evidence for, and because
Would you
um,
grant the possibility that at least our civilization would be wiped out? So let's say maybe some humans would survive, but at least the civilization, which requires a certain kind of level of sophistication of the groupings of humans, etc., etc., would not exist anymore.
no, I'm very skeptical of this idea of elimination of humans by our own means, whether it's AI
Huh.
or nuclear power or even climate change. I'm the one case I think is absolutely horrendous and would be an asteroid impact. Okay, and we know that because there's evidence for that having happened in the past. So that is incontroversial that an asteroid impact could wipe out human life
Right. So
easily.
the science that I looked, and I did my master's degree
Right,
16 years ago.
right,
The science that I was looking at in the sort of early to mid 2000s was actually using exactly that example, and was calculating that the yields would be very similar and maybe even greater to the average asteroid, especially that one that hit us 65 million years ago and caused the extinction of the
right.
dinosaurs. And part of the math relied on the fact that we have greatly miscalculated the average yields on
Mm.
most of the
Mm-hmm.
tests for the previous
Mm-hmm.
50
Yeah.
years.
Okay. Um, well, um, let's pause this because I think I'm at the limits of my own
Okay.
knowledge, and
Okay.
you may absolutely be right, and maybe you can change my mind. But um,
Okay. Fair.
I will remain right now skeptical of that claim, which it doesn't uh, doesn't mean that we shouldn't disarm nuclear weapons. That's totally crazy.
Hmm.
We have far too many for whatever it is that we think we need them for. So there are many other reasons to try and disarm nuclear armaments and weapons all across the globe. Um, Besides the fact that we might eliminate human, it still would be hugely destructive.
Okay. So let's shift our conversation then, from your point of view. Let's say people like Elon Musk have been telling us that the biggest issue we are
Right,
facing today is AI, bigger than nukes. Other
right,
people like Greenpeace, etc., have been telling us that it's climate change. Now, you
right,
just
right,
said that neither of those three you're
right,
terribly concerned about, though that's not saying that you don't think there are problems.
right, right, right,
Clearly, you do think that, they're
right,
crazy that we have so many nuclear weapons and stuff like that. But what are the big things that we should be concerned about, in your
right,
view,
right,
if it's not those?
right, right. And just to clarify, I think there's a greater than zero chance for all three of those, but like an asteroid impact, it's very, very low probability. Um, so there is above zero. Um, the one thing that I am concerned about, there's a couple things. In the short term, I'm concerned about weaponizing AI, about cyber conflict. I think that is because basically we don't have agreements about what we're allowing AI to do. Is it okay to take down the power grid of another country? Is it okay? We have agreements with nuclear. We have agreements with biologicals. We don't have agreements really with hacking and cyber conflict and cyber war. And I'm afraid that something really bad could happen um, before we come to some kind of agreement. And then with AI involved, it just really amplifies it. So weaponizing cyber conflict AI with AI, that's that's where it could really go off the rails, rather than it taking over and making paper clips. It's much more of having AI, and I'm not talking about AI soldiers, because robo soldiers I think actually might be better than human soldiers, but having AI involved in cyber hacking and kind of infiltrating power grids and all that kind of the infrastructure, I think is very, very scary. And that's something that I do think that we can work towards in making agreements on a planetary scale about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable.
So, do you think that could wipe us out, or it's also not?
No, they can't wipe us out, but it can certainly wreak havoc and make it make a mess, set us back for years, decades. But it's not necessarily going to eliminate humans. Again, it's the scenario of how AI would eliminate humans. It's just a cartoon. It's romantic. That's the thing. The idea that these things could eliminate us is a romantic fantasy that is bred by Hollywood. It's like this. It's like the lone villain at the top of the mountain. There's all this technology that works, and there's nobody there. There's no tech support. It works the first time. It's just total fantasy. And so the idea that you have this thing powerful enough that can eliminate all humans, that's a fantasy. It's very, very difficult to kill a lot of people at once over. I mean, it's like what? I don't even know how that you imagine it happening. And so um, all the intermediate steps that you'd have to do to get there would all be warning flags. We would all be up in arms. The first 1,000 people to die this way would immediately change our behavior in a very drastic way. So I would say the will to survive usually outwits the will to kill. Surviving is such a powerful force that it usually overwhelms the desire to kill. And most predators fail, right? Most attempts at predation don't work because the will to survive usually outlasts or overtrumps the predation. And so you're trying to be predator for 8 billion people. Man, that is so hard.
Well, Yuval Harari calls us a mass murdering species because every time we show up somewhere, species go extinct, according to him. In that he gives example in North America, in Australia,
Sure.
with species that we know or we can find the remains of now. And in a very short period of time, let's say a couple thousand years after humans showed up in the
Right.
neighborhood, those were gone. So the presumption is, look, we did it and we were like the smartest species in the neighborhood. Now the AIs will be, therefore, etc.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, yeah, we don't want the AIs to do that. So we have a lot of attention right now to instilling them to ethics, making them better than us, so that they don't kill all the species. And yeah, we ate our way through a lot of the megafauna because it was very handy meat packaging, and this is not a new thing. We've been doing it. However, again, if you look at the data, which I did on species loss, because I was involved with the All Species Initiative, which was to catalog. That was my initiative, was to catalog all the species on the planet.
With Craig Venter, if I remember, wasn't that?
No, with E.O. Wilson.
Oh yeah.
Craig was doing the genomic part of it. We were looking at the actual taxonomic species,
Mm-hmm.
and again, there is an overestimation of how many species have actually been lost. So there's about a species a year for the past 1,000 years, which is more than it should be, but it's not the sixth extinction. And there's a lot of assumptions in terms of those extinction rates. But the actual data, again, I'm just saying, if we let's look at how many species have been that we know about, that we've documented, that we know the name of it, and now it's gone. There's been about 1,000 over 1,000 years. Okay, so there's all kinds of estimates of other species that we don't know about that have lost. All right, so that's a hypothetical. We don't have evidence of that, but we have an estimate. Well, given the species loss of 1 per 1,000, then we can suggest it, because we only know whatever it is, 30% of the species or 5%, that therefore there must be another 95% that are gone. But we don't actually have the evidence. That's an assumption.
Right.
But the evidence so far is 1 species a year.
Okay, let's try to refocus our conversation with this, and we might actually loop back into it because it touches on power in a kind of a variety of ways. But one of my other favorites is on page 166, and it goes like this: the real test of your character is not how you deal with adversity, although that will teach you much. The real test is how you deal with power. The only cure for power is humility and the admission that your power comes from luck. The small person believes they are superior. The superior person knows they're lucky.
Right.
So tell me a little more about this.
Yeah. So this came from hanging around people who have been very lucky, the very rich, the very wealthy, the very famous, the very accomplished. And it was interesting to me to see the ones among them who admitted the role of luck in their lives. And I began to assess them, and I would admire those. I mean, they were usually the people I admired more, and that was part of the reason, was that they were aware enough to understand that um, a lot of their success came from the fact that they were born at the right time in the right place, the right body, and the right family, whatever it is, and that's so many of the things that came were not just from hard work and were not just from their own particular talents, but were luck. And from Bill Gates growing up, being with experience of hanging around computers as a kid, one of the very first in the country or the world for that matter, that's very lucky. And so and then we have luck in countrysides. Countries have luck of being blessed with, either fertile soil or a desert, and um, a lot of so there's a lot of chance in power. There's a lot of stochastic noise in who wins and who loses that power, and I think those who acknowledge that, I think, can deal with that power a little bit more civilly.
I totally agree with you, and that's why this is one of my favorite ones. But I'll tell you my concern though. I grew up in communist Bulgaria,
Mm-hmm.
and we had something that all the Eastern Bloc had at the time, which was called the cult of personality. So our great leader was called Georgy Dimitrov. He was the foremost communist, the guy who was falsely blamed to have burned the German Reichstag, and who learned German just to defend himself in the trial. And we had Stalin, we had Mao, all over the Eastern Bloc. We had those cults of personalities of our great leaders. So now, here in the free world, I live in Canada, you live in the United States. We have, especially in when it comes to entrepreneurs and around Silicon Valley, what it seems to me is another cult of the personality. So you have these legends of the
Mm-hmm.
lone entrepreneur
Right,
who literally came from nowhere and from nothing, and who built this
right, right.
empire, and therefore they earned it and they deserve it. And we have,
Yeah,
Steve Jobs, we have Elon Musk, we have Jeff Bezos, we have Bill Gates. We have so many examples that are pointed out as the flag boys, Mark
yeah, yeah.
Zuckerberg, you name it. The list is very long. So what do you think? Do you think that there is really a parallel that I'm drawing here?
Mm.
And what, if anything, is there to be learned? What's the lesson, if there's any?
Yeah, I think the parallel doesn't go very far because they don't really have much power over the way that the leaders in the Eastern Bloc had of affecting people. People can, I find it very easy to ignore, Elon. I don't have to, I don't know, like, he may have crazy ideas now. The new Elon, there was the old Elon and then there's a new Elon. Something happened in between. The old Elon actually was kind of interesting. The new Elon is like, so, anyway, he's off his rails most of the time, and I don't need to pay attention to him. On Twitter, I have names muted. There is another former president whose name is muted. I never see anything about him. I never. It's like I don't even, that name is not allowed to appear in my feed. And I tell you, we're not allowed to utter the name in our household. And because of that, he has no power over me, except when he's president. So,
He might come
uh,
back.
Yeah, I know, no, that's a nightmare. So, I mean, obviously, elected politicians have much more power than entrepreneurs. People say, well, Mark Zuckerberg has power because of Facebook. I don't believe that. I think one of the things about Facebook is that they wish to believe that they are influential, but like even in the elections, and even if you have Cambridge Analytics, it's like the power of Facebook to affect election was nothing compared to Fox News and the cable news. They actually had all the power, much more power than Facebook. Whatever happened, Facebook was sort of, they wanted to believe, and that was the story that they were telling, was no, we're influential. We can influence. Uh, we didn't influence the um, the elections, but we could have. And so no, they had very little power relative to cable TV and even talk radio, which we don't seem to want to censor. So, so I always say when we're talking about power with technologies, we always have to say compare to what. Whenever we are reviewing or evaluating technologies, is always compare to what, compared to the alternative. Yeah. So like mercury amalgam in your fillings, there may be some possible toxicity, but compared to what? Compared to cavities? Yeah, you don't. So it's always compared to what. Electric cars will have some downsides. They'll have some problems. Compared to what? Compared to gasoline engines and
Diesel.
lead. Right. Always compared to what? And the same thing with AI and other things. Is or bullying on social media. Compared to what? Compared to what happens in the hallway of the classrooms? Does it even compare? So the thing about power and technologies and the influence of these leaders is compared to what? And so I think compared to the politicians, elected politicians, no, they don't really have that much power. I think they could indirect influence and people can aspire to it, but they're much easier to ignore. Much easier to ignore.
Hmm. Uh, Let me throw in another favorite one and see if we can grab that one in another more productive way, or if we connect it to the previous one. Again, on page 189, you say, we are unconsciously distracted seeing our reflection. You can
Mm,
alleviate a lot of the fatigue
yeah,
while teleconferencing all day if you
right.
turn off your self view.
Do that with Zoom. That's the first thing I do is I turn off. Well, I'll leave it on for a second to make sure my camera's aligned. Then I turn it off, and it's a lot of my book was channeling the ancients, the Stoics, and the Bible. This is not, and this will probably go like nobody will understand this in 10 years because they'll have something else going on. But I have found as a practical advice for today, turn off your self view. I don't know how that works or why, but not seeing yourself in the mirror the entire time just reduces the fatigue.
So I totally get that, and I agree with you that it reduces Zoom fatigue. But I wonder if there's a bigger lesson here. And hear me out. I think maybe until the Venetians invented the proper mirror as we
Yeah,
know it today, which was maybe around 800 years ago,
yeah,
around the 12th
mm-hmm.
century, humanity was rarely ever so obsessed,
Yeah,
collectively and individually, about our own self-image. And we
yeah,
even had warnings about that by the ancient Greeks and the myth
mm-hmm.
of Narcissus. So I wonder, in an age where everyone is pointing the phone backwards, it seems now,
Yeah,
when the selfies have become a global phenomenon,
yeah.
where everyone is looking at themselves, I want to be here. Does that say something about, should we actually, because that's how I read this. I read this in the global
I
scale.
see. Metaphorically, yeah,
Yes.
um, yeah. I'm not a big selfie fan. I don't take selfies ever. I've never taken. I don't know if I've ever taken a selfie. My wife likes to take some with us, and that's fine. But I'm not interested in it. Um, and but I also think I suspect. I don't know. this is not a prediction I'm willing to bet on, but I suspect that this is a fad that in not that it will ever go away, but it might go away to the degree that we're now seeing it. That in 20 years from now, 30 years from now, it'll be very, oh, that was very 2020. That was this idea of it's kind of like in the early photography, people never smiled. You can kind of look at date. You can actually date photographs by the fact that people aren't smiling because that was something we learned to do. We still smile, but I think there are some cultural things that could change over time, and people just see that it was sort of like something you did, and and that everybody did it, but necessarily might date people doing it in the future. I don't know. It's not a prediction, but I wouldn't be surprised.
But does it say something about our lack of wisdom culturally and collectively, or maybe moving away from it? That obsession with the self, with the looks, with the outside things at any
No,
cost, almost. It
no, I
blows
don't
my
know.
mind.
I don't. I think it's an art form. I think the kids who are doing it, the TikTokers. I think it's a new art form. I think it's legitimate. I think it's like you know getting dressed up, performing. It's a performance. It's. I don't think that it's necessarily like something that's a cancer that's rotting at the core of culture. I think it's a art form, which is why I'm saying it may pass. I think it's a very fashionable art form, and people are doing it to kind of like see what, just exploring what you could do with yourself as a portrait. So self portraits have been around for a very long time, even I'm guessing before mirrors, but I don't know. That's a good question. Were there self portraits before
You're a
mirrors?
lot more generous and magnanimous than I am. My,
Yeah.
my concern is like cases when I watched, like, there was this terrible train accident in Italy, and someone gets run over by a train, and then the next person pulls out the phone and starts taking a selfie of the person being killed by the train and then being at the place of accident and posts that. And that's many examples, and to me that's a symptom, unfortunately, to me, and I hope I'm totally wrong.
Yeah, I think you're wrong. I I think it's art form, a fashionable art form that will not necessarily survive the long term. People get bored with it. They've all done it. Not that it will ever go away, but it may not just be as thrilling as it is right now, where people are kind of saying, um, I am the canvas. What can I do? Um, See how far they go with this selfie everywhere. Um, Again, I think in 20 years, people look back and say, 2020, that was very dated.
Well, I hope you're correct, and I am willing to bet that you're a lot wiser than I am. So, so I would bet on that fact. Um, Going back to the AI and the technological singularity, though, has any of your thinking or ideas? You said that, just like last time, you're skeptical on it and all of that. Has any of your thinking evolved or changed in any way since the last time we spoke about it 6 years ago?
Well, I don't remember what I said 6 years ago, but so skeptical. I was saying that I think there's an overhyping right now in the short term, but over long term, it's underhyped. So I am not skeptical of AI in general. I think it's incredibly. Um, I think it's the biggest thing we've ever done as a species. I mean, I think it's at the level of fire or language over the long term, over the next 100 years, and beyond. So uh, right now, there's a little, what's the word I want? These things are not. We'll look back in 30 years and say, well, you didn't have AI today. That's all I'm saying. We'll look back at what we have today and say, well, that really wasn't AI. Um, but what we have right now, I think, is what I'm calling the universal personal interns. So the stance that I believe that we're going to settle into for, let's say, the next couple of decades is AI as co-pilot, intern, assistant, team member, partner, all those varieties of working with them not taking over. I think there's going to be the impact on employment is going to be very mild, not very much impact on actual total employment. I think there'll be going to be a net gain overall. And I think that what we're going to find out is this combination of human plus AIs together being superior to human alone or AI alone, and that working with them is going to become the norm. And all different levels. There's hundreds of different varieties. Like right now, this last night, I was using the AI now built into Photoshop, so the image
Right.
generator is not a
Photoshop
separate
beta.
thing. Yeah, the Photoshop beta, right? So the
Yeah.
generative fill. Okay, so that's the way I'm going to be working with. It's a tool. It's something I'm going to be. Everybody's going to be doing. There's this idea of like we're going to not allow AI generated images. Are you not going to allow photoshopped images? Come on, it's like there's no distinction. It's just another tool that you're going to use, and most of the AI is not even going to be publicly facing. It's going to be 95% of the AI is going to be behind the scenes in the walls, in the back offices, in the plumbing, so to speak. We're not even going to be aware of most of it. There'll be some that are front facing, some that are we'll have an interface for. The great big bang that's happened in the last year is we now have a conversational user interface to these things. So
Hmm.
the powers haven't really changed it much in the last couple of years, but now we have an easy way to interface them. It's like the graphical user interface that came onto the internet, which was the web. The internet was around for decades. It was ignored. Nobody paid attention to it. Nobody believed in it. Then, when the web came along, you had a graphical user interface. You had pictures. You could move things around. And now suddenly it was the Big Bang. Well, the conversational user interface, the large language models, that is the Big Bang for AI. Now we have a very human way of interfacing conversations that's so human. And so we want that conversational interface. And now we're going to apply it to everywhere. Everywhere will have a conversational interface. And the AI part of it is not as important as the conversational interface part of it. So that's what we're going to see in the next couple of decades.
Let me grab a couple of points and see if I can wrap them up all together because we have maybe about 13 minutes, hopefully, to wrap our conversation. So I want to see if I can bring together wisdom, power, AI, advanced tech here. So here's a kind of an argument or a line of reasoning. Most of our biggest problems right now, whether they're existential or not, are self created.
Yes.
So, talk about climate change, soil erosion, nuclear weapons, many examples.
Sure. I agree.
Great. So, following that sort of starting premise, then the idea is that if our biggest challenges or problems are self created right now, they are probably the result of our ever increasing technological power,
Yes.
far outpacing our wisdom to apply and utilize that power in a non destructive, non suicidal, net positive kind of a manner. And therefore, continuing that line of reasoning, if that's true, therefore, more power, technologically speaking, without the accompanying of an equal growth of wisdom would only grow the gap, not shrink it, and therefore further deepen and enlarge our current problems.
Mm.
Because the gap between our wisdom and our power is simply growing and growing. And instead of working, people say, oh,
Mm-hmm.
we need more power, more powerful technology, more this tech. Instead of working on the technology and so much and growing the gap and therefore making things worse, we should work on the wisdom gap and close it as much as possible. Because when you gave the example of humans plus AIs,
Mm-hmm.
if the AIs follow whatever the directives coming from us, and if we lack that wisdom to be non suicidal and non destructive overall, net positive, then with more AI and more power and more tech, we're only going to do more damage than good.
I would agree. So I think I think this is a good way of putting it. Is that as our societal power increases because of technology, um, we're going to, in my terms, we're going to make whole new problems that have never existed. And most of these problems are going to be bigger than the problems that we've had in the past because they're more powerful. The more powerful the technology, the more powerful the problems. Okay. So we're headed into more powerful problems. And so we need the skills at overcoming those problems. And I think among many other skills, including ingenuity and science, we also need wisdom. Again, I think it's not the only thing we need. I think it's part of the mix. So yeah, we should be increasing our wisdom to deal with the increasing powerful problems that we are creating. Um, but and so yeah, maybe my book is a step in that direction. I think there's other things that we might want to do, like we talked about AI. It's actually trying to codify wisdom to be able to program that into society. But also, I think what we need is the imagination to imagine what the better us would look like, where it is that we actually want to go. Because so if we aren't wise enough, what does that new wisdom look like? And can we come to some consensus about it in order to choose or implement it? The one thing I would say about technology is that any solution that says that the answer is less technology, I reject. Okay, and this is where I like the new today's the new signature of the AI signature that everybody signed, which was saying yes, we should treat this seriously, like climate change and the pandemics. Well, I think it may be like climate change. I'm not sure about the pandemic. The pandemic seems to me inevitable, pandemics, but we do want to treat them seriously. That idea of I think is acceptable. The idea of like pausing development, stopping the AI, retreating from the development of AI, that's to me not a good idea. That's um, because I think the only way that we can solve technological planetary problems is with better technology, not less. It's like having, I make the analogies, technologies are like ideas made concrete, okay? And it's like a physical idea. So if I were right now to suggest a really bad or stupid idea, you, it, you would never tell me, well, you need to think less. You need to have less ideas. You would say, no, you need to have a better idea. And I think that's the same thing with technology. The solution is, when technology makes a problem, is not to have less of it, but to have better of it. And so I think wisdom is, we can think of it as a kind of technology. It's a language thing. It's a symbol arrangement. It's encasing something. So we should have better wisdom, but what we don't want is less things. We don't want to stop stuff or turn it off or decrease it. We want to actually increase things.
One of the reasons why I like this seed or fragment on page 166 I read previously on power is because I think it contains a lot of the wisdom that speaks to me, at least, having to do with humility and recognizing our luck and our privileged position, and that we didn't get to where we are collectively as a species or individually as individuals through the sweat of our brow, but because we were fortunate in so many ways that we're not even aware of. And
Well, yeah,
therefore we should have humility when we treat
right.
other species and other individuals.
Even cosmically,
Yeah.
we are lucky. Just, I mean, think about all the lucky accidents we have in terms of the gravitational pull of the moon, the the magnetic field on the planet. There are just like so many things that this planet has been lucky about, that enable life to have this Goldilocks um, range to enable us to live here, because it's very lucky that we have a planet that's as well calibrated for life as ours.
But then we have people who, many transhumanists and
Yeah.
singularitarians, for example, would go the way of the manifest destiny, and use the teleological arguments that we are special, that we are the only intelligences we know of the universe, and
Yeah.
therefore we are special, and our purpose in a way is to populate the universe and to bring intelligence to a world that lacks intelligence.
Uh-huh.
And therefore, in that way, you know, with respect, let's say, towards Ray Kurzweil's
Yeah.
projected timeline, the ultimate end of which is where the universe wakes up, we are
Uh-huh.
playing a crucial, pivotal role, and therefore we're special.
Well, that may be. I don't know about that. I mean, it may be that we're special. We still don't know. Until we do know, we can act as special. I don't think it would change much of what we would do. Um, and in other words, so I assume that we're not special, but of course we have some evidence that we're not special. We have some evidence that UFOs are already here, but we don't have concrete evidence of what that might mean. So again, it's a story that we don't have enough information about whether we are the only or not. Um, but either way, I think we should act that way. Either way, I think we should treat our luck and say, I think life is a good thing. As far as I can tell, from everything I can see, intelligence is a good thing overall. And we should maximize that reach in the universe. I think we're going to be shocked at how ill-suited humans are in any capacity in space. I don't think we're going to be sending out humans into space. I think that's another romance. I think we'll be sending out robots or uploaded stuff. But I don't think there's going to be humans into space for very long. Humans with wet tissue bodies, that version of us, I don't think it's going to go very far. But certainly some descendants, some kind of more space suitable versions might go into space, and I'm all for that. Um, it's a pretty empty space, and it would be great to fill it up with things even better than us. So I don't think we want to fill up with us, but I think we want to fill up with things better than us.
Hmm. Well, Kevin, we had a kind of a meandering conversation, which often happens in my podcast.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not your fault. That's my fault. But I have to say again, for the record, I enjoyed immensely your book. I
Mm-hmm.
suggest people check it out. It's a quick read, but it's disproportionately rewarding for how quick it is. And you can read and reread it multiple times.
I
Where can
appreciate that.
people find more about you and your work?
Easy to find. My website has my initials, so it's kk.org, and I have my blogs and the cool tools reviews and any kind of links to my other projects like the Vanishing Asia project, which I spent 50 years working on, documenting the lost culture of Asia.
The
Um,
pictures from that are amazing.
yeah, it's I'm very, very proud of that. There's 9,000 images in the books, and I'm on the socials where I'm most active on Twitter. Is my name with a number 2 in the middle, Kevin 2 Kelly, and otherwise, I hope people enjoy the book. There's a little bit more practical kind of information or advice, I guess we would call it, like the thing that made you weird as a kid can make you great as an adult as long as you don't lose it.
Yeah.
And if you're at all possible young and working, try to work on somewhere where there's not a name for what it is that you're doing. There's no language to capture it, where it may take 15 minutes to explain to your mother what it is that you're doing. That's a good sign that you're at a frontier. You're at a place where there isn't going to be a lot of competition. You're at a place that will be closer to finding what it is that you do that no one else is doing. So head in that direction of working that's ahead of the language, where there's no name, and that's the place that I would head if I was young again.
Wow, I think head in the direction where there is no name is a
Right.
perfect final message to wrap our conversation. And I love it. Kevin Kelly, thank you for being so much with us.
I appreciate it. Thank you for your great questions, for your spirit. I love um, I love this conversation because you pushed back, and it was I just find that fantastic. I just really really cherish it. So thank you.
My pleasure. And I'll probably get you in another 6 or 7 years at least.
Yeah, I'm working on another project. I'm sure it'll appeal to you. It's called the 100-Year Desirable Future. So I'm trying to do a scenario of a future filled with all this kind of stuff that I want to live in, and it's more of my radical optimism.
Fantastic. Well, the subline of my blog is Create the Future.
Yeah,
So my podcasts is Interview the Future, but the blog is Create the Future. So that will be a perfect fit, I'm sure. Well,
I'm imagining the future is my tagline.
you said you're an idea collector, or per, perpet,
Yeah, idea packager.
idea packager. That's the word. Yes, that's
Yeah,
the
yeah,
word in
yeah.
our previous conversation, and it's a
Yes,
great
yeah,
way to sum you up.
yeah.
Yes. Well, thanks again, Kevin.
Okay,
We'll
thank
be in
you. I
touch.
appreciate it.